When I was younger, probably around 10 or 11, my family decided to go on a camping trip during the summer. At that age, I didn't really care about where we were going or what the exact plans were. I just knew that I was supposed to pack a sleeping bag, a pillow, some clothes, and be ready to be away from home for a few days. We drove out to a campground that wasn't deep in the wilderness but was still pretty far from the city. It was the kind of place where people set up their tents or small campers along a gravel road that wound through the trees, with fire pits and picnic tables set up on each site. The campground itself felt alive with sound when we arrived. Kids were riding their bikes in circles on the road, people were grilling, music was playing from a couple of campsites. There was this mix of voices, laughter, and the smell of campfires drifting in the air. My parents picked a site tucked back just far enough from the road to have some privacy, but we could still see a few neighboring camps through the trees. We set up 2 tents, one for my parents and the younger siblings, and one just for me and my brother. At that age, it felt like a small privilege to have our own tent. We both liked the idea of being independent, even though our tent was only about 10 feet from where my parents set theirs up. The day passed quickly. We helped unpack, gathered some sticks for a fire, and later roasted hot dogs and marshmallows. By the time the sun went down, my stomach was full, my face was warm from the fire, and the sounds of the campground had started to die down. The bikes were gone, the music was off, and instead you could hear the occasional crack of a fire or the faint hum of people talking in low voices. By 10 or 11 o'clock, most of the sites were quiet except for the faint sounds of people settling in for the night. Eventually, we crawled into our little tent. It was a 2-person tent, barely big enough to fit both of us stretched out with our sleeping bags side by side. The air inside felt heavy and still, almost like it was holding in all the heat from earlier in the day. The nylon walls trapped every bit of warmth, and the smell of plastic mixed with dirt and the faint campfire smoke that had clung to our clothes. My brother fell asleep quickly, but I lay awake, shifting around, trying to get comfortable. The night was still, and every tiny sound outside seemed louder than usual. After what felt like hours of tossing and turning, I glanced at my little digital watch, the kind that glowed faintly when you pressed the side button. It was a little after 1 in the morning. My body felt sticky, the pillow was lumpy, and I couldn't stop rolling around trying to find a cooler spot. That's when I first noticed it. A faint sound, so soft that at first I wasn't even sure if I was imagining it. It was a whimper, barely there, just a small broken sound like someone letting out a muffled cry. I froze, listening. I told myself it was probably just another camper, maybe a little kid having a nightmare in one of the other tents nearby. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the sound came again, this time a little clearer, a little sharper. Minutes passed. The whimpering grew into something more like crying. Slow, uneven sobs that rose and fell, carrying just enough through the quiet night air to set me on edge. I pulled my sleeping bag up tighter around me even though the tent was stifling hot. My heart thudded in my chest. I thought maybe it was coming from another site, but then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The sound wasn't fading or moving. It wasn't drifting in and out like someone walking past or shifting around. It stayed in one place, steady, as though whoever it was hadn't moved at all. The crying grew louder. It wasn't the kind of crying that you hear from a child who fell down and scraped their knee. It was full, desperate, gut-wrenching crying, like someone who was truly terrified or in pain. I lay completely still, my ears straining to catch every detail. The worst part was the direction. It was right outside our tent, not far off, not at the edge of the campground, directly in front of where me and my brother were lying. I held my breath, my entire body tense. The fabric of the tent was thin, and even though I couldn't see through it, I felt completely exposed. Every sob seemed like it was aimed at me, like whoever was out there was staring straight at our little nylon shelter. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps in the gravel and dirt just outside the tent. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. The crying didn't move with the footsteps. That was the part that made my stomach twist in fear. The sound of crying stayed exactly where it was, rooted to the spot, while the faint footsteps circled. I couldn't understand it. My mind raced with questions. But none of them mattered because all I could feel was a wave of dread crashing over me. The crying grew louder and sharper until it felt like it was pressing against my ears, vibrating in my chest. It didn't drift away, didn't fade, didn't waver. It just built and built, pouring out as though whoever it was wanted the entire campground to hear. Then, suddenly, it escalated into something worse. The crying turned into screaming, a full, high-pitched, throat-tearing scream that ripped through the still night air. It went on for several seconds, longer than I thought anyone could scream without taking a breath. My whole body locked up. The scream wasn't moving. It wasn't a person running, it wasn't someone staggering. It was planted right outside the thin sheet of fabric that separated me from whatever was out there. That scream woke my brother. I felt him stir beside me and then go rigid, the same way I had when I first realized what was happening. He didn't need to ask me what was wrong. He heard it too. For a split second, our eyes met in the dim light filtering through the tent. Neither of us spoke, but the look was enough. We both knew how bad it was. Then, as abruptly as it had started, the screaming cut off. Silence. No sobs, no footsteps, nothing. Just the faint sound of the wind brushing through the trees above us and the distant crackle of a fire still burning low at some other campsite. That silence was almost worse than the noise. My ears strained, waiting for something, anything, to break it. We didn't know what else to do, so we buried our heads under our pillows, trying to block everything out. The heat inside the tent became unbearable, but neither of us dared move or make a sound. I lay there for hours, my body stiff, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every little noise outside, a twig snapping, a breeze rustling the leaves, made me flinch. Sleep never came. When the first thin light of morning began to seep into the fabric of the tent, I finally sat up, drenched in sweat and exhausted. My brother's face was pale, his eyes heavy from staying awake most of the night. We both unzipped the tent slowly, careful, half expecting to see something right outside. But there was nothing, just the empty fire pit, the damp picnic table, and the gravel road stretching out between the trees. We didn't talk about it right away. We packed up quietly, rolling our sleeping bags and folding the tent while our parents got breakfast ready. They had slept through everything, completely unaware. I kept scanning the trees, the road, the other campsites, waiting to see a sign of whoever had been out there. But no one looked distressed. No one looked like they'd been up all night screaming and crying. The families around us were packing up or cooking eggs like nothing had happened. When we finally left later that morning, I kept staring out the window of the car as we drove away, replaying everything in my head. The whimpering, the crying that grew louder without moving, the footsteps circling the tent, the screaming that had come from one spot and then stopped instantly, like a switch being flipped. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. I've thought about that night countless times since then, trying to reason it out. Maybe it was someone in the campground messing around, trying to scare people. Maybe it was a kid from another site who got lost and panicked. Maybe it was something darker, someone wandering the campground for reasons I don't even want to imagine. But the detail that always gets me, the thing that never fits, is how the sound never moved. It didn't drift, didn't fade, didn't wander. It was planted in one spot, aimed directly at us, as though whoever it was wanted to make sure we heard every second of it. That night stuck with me more than any ghost story or campfire tale ever could, because it was real. It happened, and even though nothing touched us, even though nothing entered the tent, it left a mark that I'll never shake. Sometimes, when I'm camping now as an adult, lying awake in a hot tent with the sounds of the night outside, I'll catch myself straining to listen for that faint whimper. I hope I never hear it again, but I know if I do, I'll recognize it instantly. We left that morning and never went back to that campground. My parents never knew the details of what happened, and maybe it's better that way. For me and my brother, though, it was one of those moments that shaped how we see the outdoors, how we see being alone in the dark, how we see the idea of safety when there's only a thin wall of nylon between you and whatever else is out there. I've camped all over California. Yosemite, beaches, foothills, redwood forests, and even a couple of strange spots off the beaten path. But there's one night I'll never forget. It wasn't because of storms, bears, or getting lost, but because of something that should have been obvious but somehow managed to surprise me in the worst way possible. It happened a few years back on Hicks Road. If you're from the South Bay, you've probably heard of it. Hicks Road has its own reputation. People talk about the fatal car accidents that happen on those winding, narrow stretches, the abandoned homes tucked away in the woods, the squatters who sometimes hang around them, and the strange things people claim to see out there late at night. None of that really scared me, though. By then, I'd camped enough times to know that most of the fear comes from your own imagination. The woods are noisy, dark, and endless, but for the most part, if you keep your wits about you, there's nothing supernatural lurking in them. Still, Hicks Road always carried that little edge of unease. It was a Friday evening when a few of us decided to head out there for another overnight. We'd done it a couple of times before, setting up in the same little clearing just far enough from the road to feel like we were in the middle of nowhere. The last couple of trips had been unnerving. Strange noises in the night, branches snapping when nothing should have been moving, that prickling sensation that someone was out there watching us, but nothing ever escalated. We chalked it up to raccoons, deer, or just the woods playing tricks on us. This time we arrived late. The air was cool and damp, carrying that smell of pine needles, dry dirt, and faint exhaust from the cars that had passed us on the road earlier. We set up camp the way we always did. Tents in a semicircle, fire pit in the middle, bags of gear tucked safely away. By the time the tent was staked down, the firewood stacked, and our bags unrolled, the sky had gone fully dark. Dinner was simple. We'd swung through a drive-thru on the way out and grabbed a taco 12-pack, stuffing ourselves under the thin light of the lantern. Greasy wrappers crinkled, the fire crackled, and conversation drifted into that tired lull where nobody really says much because everyone's full and the night has settled in. By midnight, the fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the sounds of the night had swallowed the clearing. Crickets buzzing, leaves shifting in the breeze, the occasional pop of sap in the fire pit. I crashed almost immediately. My sleeping bag was warm, the ground was just soft enough, and exhaustion did its job. When I fell asleep, it was deep and heavy, but it didn't last. At some point in the night, I woke up. I didn't jolt awake, didn't have a nightmare, nothing dramatic. My eyes just opened to silence, and I knew something was different. I glanced at my watch, 4:30 in the morning, the kind of time when everything is unnaturally still. No crickets, no breeze, no sound at all except for this faint, muffled noise that took me a second to process. It wasn't footsteps. It wasn't branches breaking. It sounded like people arguing outside. Low, guttural voices that rose and fell, overlapping in a way that carried tension. My heart rate picked up immediately. I sat up slowly, unzipped my sleeping bag just enough to shift forward, and leaned toward the thin wall of the tent. The voices stopped. Then something moved. At first, it was just a shadow, a massive, black shape sliding across the dim light filtering through the nylon. For a second, I thought it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me, but then another shape passed by. Then another. I froze, my body stiff, my ears straining. The shadows weren't human. They were too wide, too low to the ground, and they moved with this slow, deliberate weight. When I finally dared to peek through the thin mesh window of the tent, my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and what I saw made every muscle in my body seize. Wild boar. Not one or two, at least 6 or 7 of them, big, hulking animals with coarse black hair and heavy, powerful bodies. They weren't like the deer I'd seen on past trips, timid and cautious. These things looked solid, thick-necked, and dangerous. Some were rooting through the ground, some were brushing against the tents. Their bodies so close I could hear the coarse bristles of their fur scrape the fabric. The sound was harsh and deliberate, like sandpaper dragged across canvas. I sat perfectly still, afraid to even breathe too loudly. My chest tightened, my mouth went dry, and the thought of unzipping the tent, of making any sudden move, was unthinkable. If they spooked, if one decided to charge, I had no chance. These animals weren't small. They were 500 pounds of muscle and tusks, capable of ripping open the side of the tent and trampling anything inside. For the next 45 minutes, I stayed frozen in place while they circled and rooted around our site. The noises they made were worse than the silence. The grunts, the heavy snorts, the guttural wheezing. It sounded primal, aggressive, like something from another time. One of them pressed so close to the tent that I could see its silhouette perfectly outlined, massive shoulders rising and falling as it breathed. I could hear the wet smacking of its mouth as it chewed on something, the sharp exhale through its nose when it rooted in the dirt. The minutes crawled. My mind replayed every story I'd ever heard about wild boar. How they could gore people with their tusks, how they were territorial, how fast they could run. I thought about the thin nylon between us, about how I had nowhere to go if they turned aggressive. At one point, two of them began to tussle with each other, ramming their bodies together with heavy thuds that shook the ground beneath me. The sound of their tusks clashing made my stomach drop. I pictured them turning that same energy toward the tent, tearing through it like paper. But eventually, slowly, the noises started to fade. The wheezing and grunting grew more distant, the sounds of their hooves moving off into the woods. I didn't move, not right away. I waited, straining my ears, holding my breath every time I thought I heard them circle back. It wasn't until the faintest light of dawn started to seep into the fabric of the tent that I finally let my body relax. When I unzipped the tent and stepped out, my legs felt shaky, my body drained from holding so still for so long. The clearing looked normal at first, just our fire pit, the tents, and the dirt road winding back toward the trees. But then I saw the ground. The entire area was torn up. Deep gouges in the dirt where their tusks had dug, patches of grass and roots ripped out, footprints stamped everywhere. It looked like a battlefield. And then I saw it. The empty Taco Bell box, tipped over near the edge of the fire pit. Grease-stained wrappers scattered across the dirt. And one taco still sitting inside, half-wrapped, untouched. That was the reason they came. That one leftover piece of food. It hit me hard in that moment how close we had come to something far worse. If they'd been hungrier, if they'd decided to fight harder over scraps, if one of us had made a sound or tried to move, things could have gone bad quickly. We packed up not long after, shaken but grateful it hadn't gone further. I kept staring at the prints and the ripped-up ground, thinking about how easily the night could have ended differently. Not with us laughing about tacos, but with blood and panic in the dark. That night on Hicks Road taught me something I never forgot. It wasn't the ghost stories or the urban legends that you needed to be afraid of out there. It was the very real, very powerful animals that lived in those woods, that could show up without warning because of something as stupid and careless as leaving out food. Now, every time I camp, no matter where it is, beach, mountains, forest, I clean up every scrap of food, every wrapper, every trace of smell, because I know what it's like to sit frozen in the dark, listening to 500-pound animals breathing inches away from your head. And I never want to feel that again. Camping trips have always been a big part of my life. I've gone with friends, with family, and sometimes by myself, and I've had all kinds of experiences. Long hikes to remote lakes, quiet evenings by a campfire, sleepless nights in sweltering tents, and even a few unnerving encounters with animals. But there's one trip I'll never forget, and it's all because of something so simple and stupid: tacos. It happened on a warm summer weekend when some friends and I decided to head out to a wooded area not too far from where we lived. It wasn't a big campground with bathrooms and rangers. It was one of those rough little spots you find by driving down dirt roads until you stumble on a clearing that looks good enough to pitch a tent. We'd been there once before, and we liked how private it was. Just trees, dirt, and silence, without other campers crowding us. We arrived late in the afternoon. The sun still high, but beginning to soften into that golden evening light that makes the whole forest glow. The air smelled of pine and dust, and the only sounds were birds chirping and the occasional groan of branches shifting overhead. We set up our tent in the middle of the clearing, unloaded our bags, and made a small fire pit with stones we found scattered around. It was simple, quiet, and peaceful. On the way up, we'd stopped at a drive-thru and picked up a big box of tacos. It was meant to be our lazy dinner, something quick and easy so we wouldn't have to cook. By the time the fire was lit and the tent was ready, We were already tearing into the tacos, wrappers crinkling, hot grease soaking through paper, shredded lettuce falling into the dirt. We laughed about how it wasn't real camping food, but honestly, nothing tasted better in that moment. The night crept in slowly. The trees turned dark silhouettes, the fire crackled and popped, and the sky above opened into a sheet of stars. We sat by the fire until our stomachs were heavy and our bodies sluggish with the weight of food. At some point, the fire burned down to red coals, and one by one we drifted off into the tent, leaving the empty wrappers stuffed loosely back into the cardboard box. I didn't think much of it. In my mind, the box was just trash, and I figured we'd clean it up in the morning. I fell asleep fast. The ground was uneven, and the air inside the tent was warm, but exhaustion took over. The night was quiet except for the usual sounds of the woods, crickets, the faint rush of wind in the branches, the distant snap of a twig. I don't know how long I slept before the noises woke me, but when they did, my entire body tensed. First, it sounded like voices, low, heavy grunts, sharp snorts, and the shuffle of weight through the dirt. My mind scrambled to place it. Other campers? Drunk people wandering through the woods? Then the sound came again, clearer this time. It wasn't human. I sat up slowly, my heart already pounding, and listened. Heavy hooves dug into the dirt just outside the tent. Something brushed against the nylon wall, hard enough to make it ripple inward against my shoulder. A low, guttural wheeze followed, the kind of sound that vibrates in your chest when you hear it up close. My blood ran cold. When I dared to look through the thin mesh window, the darkness outside slowly shifted into shape. My eyes adjusted enough to see massive, hulking bodies moving around our campsite. Wild boars, at least half a dozen of them. Their thick, bristly backs looked like shadows hunched over, their short tails flicking as they rooted in the dirt. The smell hit next, a strong, musky odor mixed with damp earth and the sour stench of their breath. They were so close I could hear their teeth grinding, the wet smacking of their jaws as they tore at the ground. One of them snorted loudly and shoved its snout against the side of the tent again, brushing past as if testing what was inside. The thin nylon wall did nothing to protect me. My breathing grew shallow, my chest tight. I didn't dare move. Every muscle in my body locked into place, terrified that the slightest sound would draw their attention. Through the mesh, I saw one of them paw at the fire pit, scattering ashes and embers as if it were nothing. Another had its head buried in the cardboard box we'd left out, crunching and tearing at it like it was food. That's when it hit me, of course. The tacos. The wrappers were still covered in grease, the box reeking of meat, cheese, and oil. To these animals, it was a beacon. For the next 40 minutes, I sat completely still in my sleeping bag, every nerve in my body on fire. The noises around the tent were relentless. The scraping of tusks against rock, the thud of hooves, the sharp squeals when two of them bumped into each other fighting over scraps. At one point, two of the boars rammed into each other so hard that the ground shook, and their angry squeals cut through the night like knives. I imagined them turning on the tent, ripping it apart in the same frenzy. The worst moment came when one of them pressed its whole body against the side of the tent. I could feel its weight, the solid muscle pushing against the thin wall, its coarse bristles scratching the fabric. It stood there for several seconds, breathing hard, snorting, its hot breath audible through the nylon. My heart pounded so loud I thought it would hear me. Finally, slowly, they began to move away. The grunting grew fainter. The snapping of branches shifted deeper into the woods. I waited, paralyzed, until the first hints of dawn started to brighten the tent. Only then did I let out a shaky breath and move. When I finally stepped outside, the clearing looked destroyed. The dirt was ripped apart, deep grooves carved where their tusks had dug into the earth. The fire pit was overturned, ashes scattered in gray streaks. The cardboard taco box was shredded into pieces, greasy wrappers strewn everywhere, and the ground around it was stamped with heavy, cloven hoof prints. It looked like a battlefield, chaotic and raw. I stood there in silence, my body still trembling from the adrenaline. All of it over something so stupid, so avoidable. We'd left food out. We'd been careless. And in doing so, we'd brought half a dozen 500-pound animals right to our campsite in the dead of night. That morning burned the lesson into me deeper than any warning ever could. The woods don't forgive mistakes like that. They don't care if you're tired or lazy. Every scrap of food, every scent you leave behind, is a signal to something out there. That night, it just happened to be wild boar. Could have been worse. Now, whenever I camp, I never, ever leave food out. Not a crumb, not a wrapper, nothing. I double bag trash, lock it away, and never let it sit by the fire pit. Because I know what it's like to hear those animals breathing inches away in the dark, to feel their bodies press against the only thing separating me from them. It wasn't a ghost story. It wasn't paranormal. It was real, raw nature reminding me exactly where I was, and how thin the line is between safety and disaster when you forget to respect it. And all of it happened because of one thing. My tacos brought the boars to the yard. 2 years ago, I went camping at Lake Glenbawn in New South Wales, Australia, with a few mates. The place itself was peaceful in the way most big stretches of bush and water are. The lake stretched wide, with still water reflecting the sky, and the camping grounds had this open, quiet atmosphere that made you feel like you were far away from the rest of the world. That was part of the reason we went. No crowds, no noise, just firewood, tents, and the simple routine of eating, drinking, and watching the fire burn down at night. That particular night had started like any other camping trip. We had set up the tents in a rough circle not far from the water, where the ground was flat enough and the bush wasn't too thick. The fire sat in the middle, throwing sparks into the cool air while the smoke drifted lazily above us. We cooked, ate, and settled into the usual rhythm of drinking and swapping stories. The air smelled of burnt wood and meat fat, and the sound of crickets and frogs was steady in the background. There were 4 of us. 2 of my mates were sitting around the fire. One had gone over to his car to grab something, and I had already passed out in my tent. I remember lying down, listening to the muffled sounds of the others moving about and drifting off. I'd been drinking, so it didn't take long. The only thing I recall before sleep took over was the faint flicker of firelight through the fabric of my tent and the distant lap of water against the shore. The 4th mate had taken his plate down to a tap to rinse it. It was maybe 50 meters away from the fire, not far enough to feel isolated, but far enough that the glow of the flames wouldn't light the ground properly. That part of the campsite had patches of long grass and shadows from scattered trees. The air always seemed colder down there, close to the water and away from the warmth of the fire. It must have been just after he bent down to rinse the plate that it happened. Out of nowhere, something smashed against his head. He told me later the sound was sharp and metallic, almost like glass shattering on stone, and the suddenness of it knocked him off balance. The others around the fire looked up and saw him reel backwards, holding his head. They said the firelight caught something rolling across the dirt near him, an empty beer bottle. For a split second, they thought it had been me. Maybe I'd stumbled half drunk from my tent to take a piss and decided to throw something, not really knowing what I was doing. It was the only explanation that made any sense to them in the moment. They rushed over, checking on him, and when they looked back at the tents, they saw mine sitting quiet and zipped shut. To be sure, they came over, unzipped it, and found me still out cold inside, breathing steady, not even stirred by the noise. That's when the confusion really set in. There was no one else at the camping area. We checked earlier when we arrived, and we hadn't seen another person the whole time we'd been there. No cars, no other fires in the distance. Nothing. Just us and the lake. They sat around the fire after that, shaken, trying to piece it together while keeping an eye on the shadows beyond the clearing. The bottle hadn't just appeared out of thin air. Something or someone had thrown it. But who? And from where? A bottle doesn't just fly out of nowhere with that much force. When I woke up the next morning, I got the story from them. My mate had a sore lump on his head, proof that it hadn't just been their imagination or a trick of the firelight. We walked around the campsite, checking the area for footprints or signs of someone else being there. The dirt and grass showed nothing clear, though in some spots it was so uneven you couldn't tell if a print was human or just from animals. The weirdest part was how deliberate it felt. If it had been some random accident, say a bird dropping it, it would have landed differently. Birds scavenge and pick up shiny things, sure, but the chances of one dropping a bottle from that height and it landing square on the back of his head seemed almost impossible. We talked about it again and again, narrowing down the options. The first thought was something supernatural, but none of us wanted to really believe that. Ghosts and spirits weren't the kind of explanations we put much weight into, even if it crossed our minds. The second was that someone had been hiding out nearby, waiting, watching. Maybe a squatter, maybe someone living rough in the bush who didn't like us being there. The idea of that, someone close enough to throw something without us noticing, was worse than anything else. It meant there had been eyes on us the whole night, hidden in the dark, waiting for a chance. But the thing was, we hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't seen shadows moving, hadn't felt that usual prickling sense you get when someone's watching you. Nothing. Just the sudden violence of a bottle to the head and the confusion afterward. By midday, we were joking about it in the way people do when they don't want to sit with the fear. We called it the Glenbon Bottler. It made the whole thing sound less serious, like it was some made-up creature or a character from a story instead of an unknown person, or thing, that had been close enough to strike one of us without warning. Still, even with the joking, I couldn't shake the unease. Every time I walked to the tap after that, I looked over my shoulder. Every time the wind rustled the trees, I felt like someone was crouching just out of sight, holding another empty bottle, waiting. At night, when we sat around the fire, the shadows beyond the glow seemed thicker, heavier, like something could step forward at any moment. We stayed the rest of the trip, but it wasn't the same. The relaxed mood of camping had been replaced by a constant edge, this low hum of tension under every laugh and story. My mate's bruise faded, but the thought of it didn't. Even when we left, driving out along the rough tracks that led away from the lake, I found myself staring into the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching us go. That was 2 years ago, but every time we've gone back since, the story has come up. Someone always says it as the fire burns low, reminding the rest of us to stay alert. We laugh about the Glenbon Bottler, but under the laughter, we all know it wasn't just a story. Something happened that night, something we never figured out. And the truth is, I don't think we ever will. What I do know is this: the bush is big, empty, and quiet, but it's never truly empty. Whether it was some stranger slipping through the shadows, unseen, or just the 1 in a million chance of a bird dropping a bottle at the worst possible time, the result was the same. One of us walked away with blood running down his face, and the rest of us walked away with the knowledge that even in a place where you think you're alone, you never really are. That trip at Lake Glenbon changed the way I camp. Now, I always keep an eye on the edges of the firelight, and when the bush goes quiet, I don't assume it's just the wind. Because once you've seen how fast something can come out of the dark and hit without warning, you realize how vulnerable you really are. And every time I hear a bottle clink, I think about that night and about the Glenbon Bottler. I still remember the first time we laughed about the Glenbon Bottler. It started as a way to make sense of something that had no real explanation. A bottle out of nowhere, cracking against the back of my mate's head as he rinsed a plate by the tap. No one around, no sign of anyone else camping nearby, no sound of footsteps in the bush, just us, a fire, and the lake. That moment turned into a story we carried with us, a kind of inside joke that only we understood, though underneath the laughter there was always something unsettled. For years after that night, we kept the joke alive. Every time we went back to Lake Glenbon, someone would bring it up. When the fire burned low and the shadows grew long, we'd talk about keeping watch for the bottler. My mate would tap his scar where the bottle had hit him, shake his head, and grin like it was all just a silly memory. But I could see the truth in his eyes. He hadn't forgotten the fear of that first strike, the sudden shock of something that made no sense. Neither had I. We'd sit there, beers in hand, half daring the moment to happen again, half hoping it never would. Trips went by without incident. No flying bottles, no hidden figure in the trees, no surprises. After a while, the edge dulled. The story became just a story, told the way you might tell a campfire tale that makes people smile but never really frightens them. Even I stopped expecting anything to happen. The fire would die down, the night would grow quiet, and I would feel myself relax, convinced that whatever strange thing had happened that first night was never coming back. That's how it goes with legends, I guess. They fade into the background until you don't even believe them yourself anymore. It was years later when it happened again. We were back at Lake Glenbon, the same group, a little older now, maybe a little more worn down. We'd set up camp in nearly the same spot, close to the water but not so close that the ground got muddy. The fire was big, throwing heat against the cool night air. Smoke drifted in lazy spirals above us, and the lake was flat and black, like a piece of glass. We cooked, ate, drank, and let ourselves settle into that old rhythm. The bottler came up in conversation, of course, but this time it was more of an afterthought. Someone mentioned it, everyone laughed, and then we went back to talking about work, relationships, and all the little things that had filled the years since we first came here. Nobody was tense. Nobody was scanning the shadows. Nobody believed it would happen again. At some point, my mate grabbed his plate and wandered down to the tap to rinse it off. It was almost identical to that first night. The distance, the firelight behind him, the faint crunch of dirt under his shoes as he walked away. I watched him go without thinking much of it. He bent down, the plate in his hand, the sound of water trickling from the tap. The rest of us sat back in our chairs, talking, not paying him much attention. And then it happened, out of nowhere, just like before. The sound of glass breaking against bone and dirt tore through the quiet. He staggered, hand flying to his head, and the unmistakable shape of an empty bottle rolled across the ground at his feet. The sound was so sharp, so sudden, it made my stomach drop. I froze, every part of me remembering the story we'd carried for years but no longer expected to relive. We rushed over, hearts pounding, and there it was again. The same bruise already swelling, the same look of disbelief on his face. The fire behind us flickered, casting long shadows into the trees. The bush was silent. No footsteps, no laughter, no movement. Just silence, broken only by the ragged sound of his breathing and the faint clink of the bottle as it shifted in the dirt. We searched. Of course we did. We spread out, scanning the ground for footprints, straining our ears for any sound of someone running off. There was nothing. Just as before, it was like the bottle had been plucked out of thin air and hurled with perfect aim. The bush swallowed everything, leaving us with only the echo of the strike and the proof swelling on my mate's head. Standing there in the dark, I felt the weight of those years of laughter crash down. We had joked about it, teased each other about it, even hoped in some small way that the bottler would return just so the story wouldn't die. But when it actually happened, when that bottle hit again, I realized how wrong we had been to treat it lightly. Legends don't fade. They wait. They linger just out of sight until you've let your guard down. That night, none of us slept well. Every sound in the bush set my nerves on edge. The crack of a branch, the rustle of grass, even the faint lap of water against the shore. All of it felt heavier, sharper, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the next strike. I sat in my tent, staring at the thin fabric between me and the night, knowing that whoever or whatever the bottler was, they had been close enough to hit again. Close enough to remind us they were still out there. When morning came, we packed up early. Nobody said it outright, but the bottler had become more than just a joke again. The legend had teeth. It had patience. It had returned when we no longer believed it would. Driving away from Lake Glenbon that day, I kept looking back at the water, at the empty fire pit, at the tap where both strikes had happened. I realized something chilling. That place didn't feel like just another campsite anymore. It felt marked, like it belonged to the bottler. And if we ever went back, if we ever sat around that fire again, I knew I'd spend the whole night waiting for the sound of glass cutting through the dark. The legend lives not because we tell the story, but because it told itself again years later when we had stopped expecting it. That's the worst part of it all. The bottler doesn't just exist in memory. He exists in the silence between the crackle of firewood, in the shadows at the edge of camp, in the split second when you feel safe enough to let your guard down. And deep down, I know it wasn't the last time. That night is burned into my memory, not because anything truly dangerous happened, but because of how fast my brain convinced me it was something far worse than it actually was. It's strange how the woods, or in this case the open hills, can twist ordinary things into nightmares when the sun goes down and the only light you have comes from a small campfire and a torch beam. We had set up camp in a spot just off a dirt road, not too far from a field that sloped up into the hills. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every little sound seem louder than it really is. We had finished eating and were sitting around the fire, just talking, letting the flames burn low. The air had a chill to it, and the night stretched out wide and black above us. Out there, away from towns or traffic, the stars looked endless. The fire was the only thing holding back the darkness. At some point, one of my mates decided to grab his torch and wander a few steps from the fire. He was shining it around lazily, mostly just out of boredom. The beam cut through the smoke, landed on bushes, rocks, patches of grass. Then, without warning, he lifted it higher up the hill, and that's when we all froze. A whole line of glowing green eyes stared back at us. At first, there was no shape, no outline, just those eyes. Dozens of them, perfectly still, scattered across the slope in uneven rows. My stomach dropped instantly. Something about that many sets of eyes reflecting at the same time made the hair on my arms stand up. They looked too high off the ground, too steady, too deliberate. For a few seconds, I couldn't even process what I was seeing. The fire popped behind me, but I barely heard it. My mind went straight to the worst possible explanations. Predators, strangers, something waiting for us in the dark. The silence of the night made it worse, because those eyes didn't move, didn't blink, didn't give away what they belonged to. They just stared, glowing in the beam of the torch, as if they had been there all along, watching. My mate slowly lowered the torch, then lifted it back up, sweeping across the hill. The eyes followed wherever the beam went. More of them seemed to appear, glinting in and out of the grass, and I felt my throat tighten. It didn't matter how many times I blinked or squinted. It still looked like a line of creatures, frozen in place, waiting for something. We didn't speak. Nobody moved. For a long stretch, the only sound was the faint crackle of our fire and the pounding of my own heartbeat. My skin prickled, my legs felt heavy, and I caught myself trying to count the eyes as if that would make sense of it. 4, 8, 10, 12, maybe more. Too many for anything I wanted to deal with in the middle of the night. The torch beam finally steadied on one pair of eyes, and that's when I noticed something different. A faint outline, bulky, broad, a shape too familiar to be threatening once I focused on it. My brain caught up with what my eyes were seeing, and the tension in my chest started to ease. They were cows, just cows standing on the hillside, chewing grass in the dark, their eyes glowing green like ghostly lanterns in the torchlight. The moment the realization sank in, relief washed over me so hard I laughed under my breath. My body still buzzed with adrenaline, but now it felt ridiculous. The cows weren't moving because they had no reason to. They weren't predators, they weren't strangers sneaking around. They were just livestock grazing, probably as confused by us as we had been by them. I couldn't help but think about how easily the mind plays tricks in the dark. For those first few seconds, when all I could see were those glowing eyes, it felt like something out of a nightmare. My imagination filled in the blanks with danger because that's what the darkness does. It takes the unknown and paints it with fear. It didn't matter that it was just cows. For that moment, I believed it was something else entirely, something I wasn't prepared to deal with. We sat back down by the fire, the torch beam finally dropping away from the hillside. Nobody admitted how tense we'd been, but it was obvious in the way we all shifted in our seats, shoulders loosening, breaths coming easier. The fire suddenly felt warmer, brighter, like a shield between us and the vast blackness pressing in from the edges of camp. I kept glancing back up the hill even after I knew what was there. The cows had gone back to grazing, some moving slowly, others standing perfectly still. Without the torchlight, they disappeared into the night, and it was as if they had never been there at all. But I knew they were, and I knew how close I'd come to letting fear completely take over. Later that night, lying in my tent, I thought about how silly it sounded to be afraid of cows. But fear isn't logical when you're out in the dark, miles from anywhere, when the only thing separating you from the unknown is a thin layer of nylon. Out there, the line between reality and imagination blurs fast. Your eyes see something, your brain misfires, and suddenly you're convinced you're staring at something monstrous. By morning, it was almost funny. We joked about being stalked by killer cows, and someone even mooed while we packed up our gear. But underneath the laughter, I carried the memory of that first moment when the torch hit the hill and those eyes lit up like tiny green flames. The rush of dread, the absolute certainty that we were being watched by something unnatural, stayed with me. It wasn't paranormal, it wasn't dangerous, but it reminded me how small and vulnerable camping makes you feel. Out there, away from everything familiar, the dark has a way of twisting the ordinary into the terrifying. And sometimes, even something as harmless as cows can give you the worst scare of your life. When I think back to that camping trip, the memory that always comes back the strongest isn't the fire or the food or even the campsite itself. It's that walk in the bush and the strange way it played out. At the time, I was only about 10 years old, but even then I knew something about it wasn't right. We had gone camping with my family and some extended relatives. It was one of those longer trips where people brought a mix of tents, tarps, and too much gear. The place we chose was fairly isolated. The road in was rough, the kind where you had to drive slowly so you didn't bottom out, and once we were in, we were in. No shops, no quick escapes, no constant flow of people. Just bush, trees, and the sound of birds and insects. The second day, we decided to go for a walk. The path was one of those trails that felt like it had been there forever. Dirt packed hard from countless feet, tree roots crossing like veins, branches bending over to form shaded tunnels. The smell of dry earth and eucalyptus hung heavy in the air, and in the distance you could hear the occasional call of magpies echoing. There were 4 of us on that walk, me, a cousin, and 2 adults. We weren't rushing. The track wound up and down through the bush, and every bend felt like it revealed something new. Sometimes it was just another stretch of trees. Sometimes it was a glimpse of open space where sunlight poured through. It was along one of those bends that we saw her. She wasn't frightening, not at all. Just an older woman, probably in her late 60s or 70s, walking by herself. She wore simple clothes, the kind you'd expect someone to wear for a stroll: loose pants, a faded shirt, sturdy shoes. She wasn't carrying a backpack or a bottle of water. No hat, no walking stick. Just walking slowly, as if she had all the time in the world. That alone was odd. This wasn't a busy place. We hadn't seen another soul since we'd arrived, and the track itself was far from the main camping area. She gave us a polite nod as she passed, nothing out of the ordinary, but it stuck with me. Something about her being alone, older, and out here in the middle of nowhere didn't quite make sense. We kept walking. Nobody said much about it, but I remember glancing back a few times. She was gone quickly, swallowed up by the twists of the path. Eventually, the walk carried us further out, away from that moment. The track looped through the bush, winding in what felt like every direction, but always forward. After what must have been an hour or more, we began to circle back. I could feel the tiredness in my legs, the kind of dull ache that comes from uneven ground and constant steps. I was ready to be back at camp, back where the fire crackled and the tents waited. And that's when we saw her again. She appeared ahead of us on the path, walking toward us just like before. Same clothes, same slow, steady pace, the same expression, as if she had been here all along. At first, I thought maybe it wasn't her. Maybe it was another woman who just happened to look similar. But as we got closer, I knew it was her. There was no mistaking it. The problem was, it didn't make sense. When we'd first passed her, she had been moving in the opposite direction. There was no way she could have circled around to meet us here unless there was some shortcut, some hidden track we didn't know about. But we hadn't seen one. None of us had. And even if there was, how had she managed to time it perfectly to cross paths with us again? We all noticed it. It wasn't just me. The adults exchanged quick looks, the kind that say, "Did you see that too?" My cousin stiffened beside me, silent. None of us said a word out loud, but the weight of the moment pressed heavy. She passed us the same way she had before, calm and quiet, eyes ahead. No sign that anything unusual had happened. But inside, I felt a ripple of unease I couldn't shake. The rest of the walk back felt different. Every rustle in the bushes, every shadow between the trees seemed sharper. I found myself glancing behind us, half expecting her to appear again, though of course she didn't. We made it back to camp without another sighting, but the air had shifted. That night, I lay in my tent replaying it over and over. My young brain tried to explain it. Maybe there was another path we hadn't noticed. Maybe she lived nearby and knew secret tracks. Maybe it was coincidence, her choosing to double back at the right moment. I told myself those things, but none of them felt solid. None of them erased the strangeness of it. The adults talked about it the next day, but not for long. They brushed it off, settling on the idea that there must have been some alternate route we hadn't seen. That explanation stuck, at least on the surface, but it didn't settle me. Even now, years later, I can still picture it clearly. The way she appeared the second time, like a scene repeating itself in a loop. I don't call it paranormal. I don't believe in ghosts, and there was nothing ghostly about her. She was real, solid, human, but it was the kind of glitch that made you question the way the world fits together. Like maybe things aren't as straightforward as they seem, and every once in a while, the rules bend just enough to remind you how little you really understand. When I think about that trip now, the memory comes back in pieces. The smell of the fire, the rough feel of the dirt under my shoes, the way the shadows stretched long in the late afternoon, and in the middle of all of it, that woman, seen once, then again, in a way that shouldn't have been possible. It wasn't terrifying in the way a dangerous animal or a stranger in the night would have been, but it unsettled me deeply. It showed me that fear doesn't always come from obvious threats. Sometimes it comes from the quiet things that don't make sense, the things your brain can't explain no matter how many years pass. That bush walk should have been nothing more than a memory of dirt and trees. Instead, it became something I've carried with me, something that still makes me glance twice when I see someone on a lonely track. Because even now, part of me wonders, if I kept walking long enough, if I circled back again, would I see her once more, coming down the path as if she'd never left? When I think back on high school, most of the memories are blurry and harmless, but every once in a while one comes back that sticks out for how strange it felt. This one has stayed with me all these years. It wasn't loud or violent or even dangerous, but it rattled me at the time and still does now when I let my mind wander back to it. I went to a pretty small high school, the type where you could walk down the hall and recognize everyone you passed, even if you didn't know their name. Faces became familiar, and because of that familiarity, the odd moments stood out even more. Everyone had their role, their reputation, their little box they were stuffed into. Some kids were athletes, others were quiet bookworms, and then there were the outcasts. Nicole was one of them. Nicole was the kind of girl who drew attention without trying to. She wore clothes that didn't fit the trend. Her hair always looked unbrushed, and she had this way of saying things that sounded like riddles or spooky predictions. It wasn't uncommon to hear her mutter something under her breath in class. Words that made no sense but carried a strange weight. A lot of kids were cruel to her, though back then we didn't see it as cruelty. We just laughed it off, passed it around as jokes. Looking back, I feel ashamed of that, of the way we treated her. But in high school, that kind of thought doesn't cross your mind much. One morning, my friend and I were leaning against the lockers, half awake, talking about nothing important. It was one of those mornings where the air smelled like pencil shavings and floor cleaner, and the low buzz of voices carried through the hallway as kids shuffled into their first classes. Then Nicole walked by. She moved the same way she always did, quick steps, eyes fixed ahead, like she wanted to get where she was going without being noticed. But of course, everyone noticed her. She stuck out like a sore thumb in that environment. As she passed us, my friend nudged me and said something stupid, calling her witchy woman. We both snickered, not because it was funny, but because that's what kids like us did, mock what we didn't understand. We watched her walk down the hallway until she turned the corner, out of sight. The moment should have ended there. It was just another passing in the hallway, another day at school. But less than 30 seconds later, she walked past us again. Same pace, same look on her face, same direction. I remember freezing. My friend's laughter died in his throat, and we both just stared as she passed again, silent, heading toward the same corner she had just disappeared around. The layout of the school made that impossible. The hallways didn't connect in a way that someone could circle back that quickly, especially not without doubling back in front of us. There was no side door she could have slipped through, no shortcut that would have allowed her to appear again in the same hallway so fast. We looked down the hall as she turned the corner the second time, waiting to see if she would reappear, but she didn't. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The noise of the hallway returned to normal in my ears, but my body felt tense, like something had gone wrong with the world in a way I couldn't understand. I wanted to brush it off as nothing, but the timeline didn't fit. The walk she made the first time was too fresh in my mind, and there was no way she could have looped around and done it again so soon. The rest of the day, I kept thinking about it. In class, during lunch, even at practice later in the afternoon, I found myself replaying that short moment over and over. Maybe there was another girl who looked like Nicole, but in a school our size, I knew that wasn't possible. Maybe my eyes had tricked me, but my friends saw it too. We hadn't imagined it. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, wondering if maybe Nicole had some way of messing with people. She had always been strange, and maybe she thrived on confusing others. But I knew that wasn't true either. She never seemed to want attention. In fact, she seemed like she wanted the opposite. As time went on, the memory faded into the background, but every once in a while, something would drag it back into my thoughts. Walking down a hallway alone, catching sight of a familiar face twice in quick succession. Little things like that would remind me of it and make the hairs on my arms rise. Now, looking back with more years behind me, I don't think it was anything paranormal. I think maybe there was some hallway or cut-through that we didn't know about, some architectural quirk of the school that allowed her to circle back. Or maybe the timing just worked out in a way that made it look impossible, when really it wasn't. Brains play tricks like that, especially when you're young and don't understand how easily perception can be fooled. Still, no matter how much I try to explain it away, I can't fully let go of the feeling I had in that moment. The way my stomach dropped when I saw her pass again, the way my chest tightened as my mind scrambled to make sense of it. It wasn't fear in the usual sense. It was the fear of not understanding, of being presented with something that broke the normal flow of reality. The older I get, the more I realize that those moments stick with you, not because they mean something supernatural, but because they remind you that the world isn't always neat and tidy. Sometimes things happen that you can't fit into your framework of logic, and you have to sit with that discomfort. I haven't seen Nicole since high school, and I often wonder what happened to her. I hope she found a better place than that small school hallway, where kids like me laughed at her behind her back. I hope she grew into herself and found people who didn't treat her like an oddity. But no matter what became of her, I'll always remember that morning. A hallway that was too short to hold two versions of the same girl, and two stupid kids left standing there, wide-eyed, realizing that sometimes the world doesn't play by the rules you think it does. And that's what made it scary. Not the girl herself, not even the repetition, but the sudden realization that reality, for a moment, felt like it slipped and you couldn't explain why. I had been hiking sections of the Appalachian Trail for a few years when this particular trip happened. I'd gone out alone, carrying a light pack, a tent, and enough supplies to keep me comfortable for about a week. The trail felt endless and quiet in the way only long stretches of wilderness can, where the sounds of the modern world fade out completely and all you hear are your own footsteps, the steady drag of your pack straps, and the calls of birds cutting through the canopy. It was late summer, the kind of season where the woods feel alive but not overwhelming. The air was warm but not sweltering, the ground still soft with patches of green, and at night you could sit by a small fire without freezing or sweating. I had set up camp at a clearing just off the trail, far enough from any shelter or road that I felt completely alone. That isolation was always part of the appeal for me. Losing myself in the forest, away from everything. On the second evening, after a long day of climbing ridges and winding through switchbacks, I was walking back toward my camp after fetching water from a small creek. The light was fading, That golden period when the sun slants low and casts long shadows across the trees. It was then that I noticed her. She was an older woman, walking slowly along the trail, wearing a long, pale shirt and carrying what looked like a small bag slung over her shoulder. What stuck out most was her hat, a straw-woven one with a yellow ribbon tied neatly around the base. It looked delicate, almost out of place in the roughness of the Appalachian woods. I nodded slightly as I passed her, the way hikers sometimes acknowledge one another without breaking stride. She didn't look at me, though. She just kept walking in the opposite direction, her eyes straight ahead. I thought little of it at first. People hike all sorts of sections of the trail. You run into all kinds, from seasoned backpackers with expensive gear to casual walkers out for a short day trip. But something about her stuck in my mind. She seemed older than most of the hikers I usually saw out there, and her clothes didn't look suited for a long trek. The hat especially seemed fragile, like something you'd wear gardening, not on a trail that could stretch on for miles. I went back to camp, made a small fire, cooked, and eventually settled into my tent. The night was uneventful. I heard the usual noises, wind through the trees, a few twigs snapping somewhere in the distance, maybe from a deer nosing around, but nothing unusual. By morning, the memory of the woman had faded. The next day, I hiked further north. The trail was quiet, weaving in and out of dense stands of trees, occasionally breaking into ridgelines where the view spilled wide over rolling hills. I covered a decent amount of ground, stopping only to snack or refill water. By late afternoon, I was tired, my legs heavy, my back aching from the pack. As I rounded a bend, I saw movement ahead. It was her again. The same woman, same straw hat with the yellow ribbon, same slow but steady walk. She was coming toward me this time, from further along the trail I was heading into. My stomach dropped. I stopped dead in my tracks for a moment, my brain struggling to catch up. I remembered clearly the direction she'd been going the night before, away from where I was now. Unless she had turned around after passing me and hiked all night and all day, there was no reason she should have been here, approaching me from the other direction. I walked past her again. Up close, she looked weathered, her skin lined, her eyes set forward with no sign of acknowledgement. Her bag looked nearly empty, her clothes lightly dusted with dirt as though she'd been walking for a while. Again, no nod, no greeting, no eye contact. Just that same steady forward movement, the yellow ribbon catching a glint of sunlight before she disappeared behind me. The rest of the day, my mind spun with possibilities. Had I imagined the first time? No, I remembered it too well. Had she somehow looped around? But on that stretch of the trail, there weren't any loops, just long, winding miles that didn't connect back easily. And even if there had been, the timing didn't make sense. By the time I made camp that evening, the woods felt heavier. The sounds around me seemed sharper, each crack of a twig making me sit up straighter. I replayed both encounters in my head again and again, trying to find a hole in my memory. There had to be an explanation. I even tried to convince myself that maybe it was two different women. But no, the same hat, the same ribbon, the same quiet, steady stride. That night, sleep came in restless patches. I woke several times, sure I had heard movement near my camp. Every time I poked my head out, the forest was still. The fire had burned low, only embers glowing faintly. I lay back down, my ears straining against the silence. By morning, nothing had happened. No signs of anyone near me. No tracks in the dirt around my tent. Nothing disturbed. Still, I packed quickly, eager to put more miles between myself and the unease gnawing at me. I never saw her again on that trip. I hiked another 3 days before leaving the trail and heading back to civilization. But the image stuck, the same woman, same hat, same ribbon, appearing twice in ways that didn't make sense. Years later, I still think about it. I don't believe it was anything supernatural. I think maybe there was some fork in the trail I hadn't noticed, some side path that allowed her to appear again from another direction. Or maybe my memory blurred the timeline, making it seem closer together than it really was. When you're tired, hungry, and walking long distances, your brain can play tricks. But even with all the explanations I've tried to force onto it, I can't shake how wrong it felt in the moment. The unease of knowing I had seen the same person twice in a way that didn't fit, out in the middle of nowhere with no one else around. And what lingers most even now is that hat. Straw woven with a yellow ribbon. Out of place, delicate, standing out in the wilderness like a marker I wasn't meant to forget. I never saw her face clearly, not enough to describe her, but that hat is burned into my memory. When I think back on it, what makes it unsettling isn't just seeing her twice. It's realizing how easily the mind can be unsettled when the patterns you rely on bend, even slightly. On the Appalachian Trail, where everything is supposed to make sense, north, south, step by step, it only takes one moment like that to remind you how fragile your grip on certainty really is. That camping trip was supposed to be like all the others, simple, tiring in the good way, full of long days and short nights, sitting around fires and smelling of smoke until the morning you finally headed home. We went to a site I had been to before, the kind of place that has a mix of cabins and open spaces for tents. It wasn't deep in the wilderness, but it was far enough out that once night fell you had the full dark of the woods pressing in on you, with only the firelight holding it back. There were enough of us on that trip that space was tight. Most people brought tents and spread them out around the main clearing, but I ended up being the odd one out. There wasn't room for me in the other tents, so I was given one of the cabins. It wasn't luxurious, just one of those long wooden buildings with rows of bunks, a small kitchen at one end, and a musty smell that reminded me of every scout camp and summer trip I'd ever been on. The cabin was completely empty except for me, and that detail stuck in my head right away. At first it felt like I had lucked out. More space, no one snoring, a roof over my head. But it also made me uneasy to know I'd be sleeping in there alone. The first night was fine. I was tired enough that once I crawled into one of the bunks, I was asleep almost instantly. The real moment I remember happened the second night. We had been sitting around the fire for hours, talking, burning through logs, cooking whatever scraps we had left. Eventually, one by one, everyone drifted off to their tents, and I walked alone back into the cabin. It was quiet, the kind of quiet you only hear when you're far from any road or house, when even the air feels heavier. I don't know how long I had been asleep before I woke up. It wasn't a full awakening, more like when your body stirs before your mind has caught up. I rolled onto my back and blinked up at the dark ceiling. That's when I noticed it, a single point of light. At first I thought it was a star I could see through a crack or a skylight I hadn't noticed before. The light was so sharp, so blue, it looked exactly like one of those cold, distant stars you see in the winter sky. But there was no skylight in that cabin, no gaps that I had seen earlier, just a solid roof made of old wood beams. I stared at it, half expecting it to shift, to flicker, to show me it was just a trick of my tired eyes. But it stayed there, steady and constant, a pinprick of bright blue against the dark wood above me. I lay there, frozen between curiosity and unease. The more I stared, the more unnatural it seemed. It wasn't diffused like a reflection, and it didn't waver like light bouncing off a shiny surface. It was precise, focused, almost like it had its own source, its own purpose for being there. My eyes watered from not looking away, and in the back of my mind, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a trick of the moon, or some weird way the fire outside was bouncing off a nail in the roof. But the fire was out, and the moon wasn't that blue. I tried to roll over, to ignore it, but every time I shifted I felt its presence pressing into me, like it was aware of me noticing it. My skin crawled. The logical part of my brain begged me to sit up, to climb onto the top bunk and press my face to the ceiling until I found something physical that could explain it. But the rest of me, the part that was awake enough to feel the strangeness of the situation, kept me still. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I must have fallen asleep again. My body just gave up, exhaustion overriding everything else. When the sun came through the cabin windows the next morning, my first thought was of that light. I sat up quickly, blinking in the daylight, and stared at the ceiling. The wood looked plain, exactly as it had before. Rough boards, a bit stained from age, no holes, no cracks, no shine. I climbed onto the top bunk and examined every inch where the light had been. Nothing, not even a nail head, just bare wood. I stepped down, Looked again from the angle of my bed, trying to force the light to appear. But there was nothing. No reflection, no trick. Just the emptiness of an old ceiling staring back at me. All day it stuck with me. I kept trying to reason it out. Maybe my eyes had adjusted weirdly when I woke up in the dark. Maybe I'd been half dreaming. Maybe I'd imagined it entirely. But the memory of that sharp, star-like point of blue was too vivid to brush away. I knew what I'd seen, even if I couldn't explain it. That night, I dreaded going back to the cabin. I lingered by the fire longer than usual, waiting until most of the others were already zipped up in their tents before I finally trudged back. I lay awake for hours, staring at the same spot on the ceiling, daring it to happen again. But it didn't. The woods stayed dark and empty. I dozed eventually, but lightly, waking up at every creak or sigh of the old cabin. The rest of the trip passed without anything unusual. The nights were long but uneventful. The cabin stayed the same, quiet, a little damp, always with that faint wooden smell. But no more strange lights appeared. By the time we left, I had convinced myself to file it away as one of those unexplainable things that happen sometimes. Still, even now, I can picture it perfectly. A point of blue light, sharp as a needle, brighter than it should have been, hanging right there above me. It wasn't frightening in the way of loud noises or sudden shocks, but it left a mark in my memory that feels heavier than those things ever do. The part that unsettles me most is how certain I am of what I saw, paired with the complete lack of evidence after. Nothing to chase, nothing to test, nothing to explain. It sounds small when I tell it, almost boring compared to the wild stories people share about the woods. But when you're lying awake at night in an empty cabin, with the dark pressing in from all sides, even the smallest thing can feel huge. It can take something ordinary, like a plain wooden ceiling, and turn it into something you'll never look at the same way again. And that's what has stayed with me. Not the light itself, but the way it changed the cabin for me. The way it made me realize how quickly your sense of safety can shift. One second you're just a tired camper, and the next you're staring up at something that doesn't belong, wondering why it's there, and why it feels like it's watching you.